The older children try to help the younger ones. And I was 4 when I was there. And we were there until that school closed.
And the name of the school was?
Was Poplar, Double Poplar. The churches were the ones who had the one-room schools. So the members of the churches were the ones who financed the school, the community or whomever, that's how the school was financed. And after, I remember her name was Miss Alice Nicholas, was my teacher. My mother had been referred to as Miss Alice. When this lady came along, she was a Miss Alice also, but I guess for my mother's entire life, she was referred to as Miss Alice in the community because she had been the first teacher there. The area that I was in was surrounded by some, I guess you would say, middle class and upper class and wealthy white farmers, okay, in that area. And of course, they always looked down. But one of the things I thought that was just so unbelievable was if a white person came to your house, that person had to be served in the dining room. Okay, in most cases they would not eat, in your kitchen. But during the times, like my father had raised wheat and those types of crops, and usually the machinery that they used to, to cut like wheat, for instance. If someone, a person had they called it thrashing machine. They called it a thrasher because it would cut and thrash the wheat at the same time. That was a person who, they didn't cut and thrash at the same time, I don't think. They would cut the wheat, and then the thrashing machine would come, the person with the thrashing machine. But anyway, when they were doing any of that harvesting, the farmers would get together. They would go and if there's a big farm, if they were doing it, all the men around would go and, they'd support them, and then they would send their people to the smaller farms. And I don't think any money was exchanged there. They would, send the help around. So, and then the white men, although they maybe had no higher status than anyone else did, but when they were served, they had to eat in the dining room. And the black help would eat in the kitchen or outside, depending on the weather. Now, our house, as I remember, we had a small dining room and a small kitchen that had a big a wood-burning stove in there, and that's how people cooked, on these big stoves. So if you've been cooking all day on a hot day in the middle of August, that kitchen and dining room would be burning. But that's how they would want to be served, in the dining room. So they would be in there terrible. Everybody else would be out in the yard at a picnic table having all that. I said, oh, how stupid. But that's how they had to be served. Mm-hmm. And so I'm telling you this story because this is a terrible one. There was one of the farms. There were two. Was a family. It was a sister and another sister and a brother. This one sister was married to Mr. I don't know if I should call his name. Is it okay?
It's okay.
Was married to Mr. Gray. The other farm belonged to her brother and her sister, brother and sister. Neither one of those ever married. And they had Mrs. Gray, Mr. and Mrs. Gray often had help who lived with them in their house. The Daniels, Mr. Daniel and Miss Daniel, I always thought they were married for years, but they were sister and brother. They had help that lived with them also, and they had a house, I know, on the property that they lived with them, lived on the property. It was a house.
Now, just to be clear, were these white farmers?
These were white farmers.
Okay, and black workers?
Black workers,
okay.
Right. White farmers and black workers. Occasionally, sometimes they would have white workers too, but their white workers were treated separately, differently, like they were.
Mhm.
On the one of those times, and when they were harvesting, when they were cutting the wheat, if you've ever seen a regular old farm mower, it has a long blade out on the side, and that's the way the thing that cut the wheat, the machinery that cut the wheat, was similar to that. Was this long blade out on the side, and that it went around like that. The people, if they didn't have one that automatically wrapped those bale and the wheat comes off, and you would have to tie it into little bundles. Okay, if you didn't have one that some of the machinery would come over, grab it, and tie it, but often they didn't, and you would have somebody who would have to grab it. And I think in this particular one, it did have one that would tie it. I was small, and I don't remember all of that, but I do know what the machinery was. It had this long blade that went back and forth, and you would have a driver and two horses pulling it. Well, the fellow who lived on the farm, his name was Ike Woodson. He had a family living there, his wife, and at that time, as I recall, there was 4 girls, his wife and 4 girls living there. And somebody would, because in the middle of the wheat field there would be little brushes that would come up, during the time, and that thing would not be able to cut those. And you'd have somebody walking along, trying to keep things going. And just as Ike apparently went to move that out of the way, the horses got into a bee's nest, and it cut Ike's leg. And that farm was directly across the street from a road, wasn't a street, road from us. It was a hot day, and I know they called my mother, and she ran across there, and they brought him to our house, and we used to have like a fainting sofa.
Mhm.
And I remember they put that on the back of a truck, and she tore her clothes trying to make a tourniquet to save him, and Warrington, the hospital, wouldn't take him, and they went in trying to make it to Freedman's Hospital in Washington. Of course, he died. So that's not only the saddest part of the story. There's this woman there with all of those children, and they put her out, because of course Ike wasn't there to work. So different members, my mother and father, and they took 1 child. An aunt of ours took 2, and somebody else took 1. And there could have been more of them, but they were spread around in the neighborhood. And prior to that, my parents had also had another girl along prior to that who was a cousin to this girl. Their mothers had been sisters, and she was already living with us. I didn't know didn't know she wasn't our sister, because we were so young when she came there that she was there. And the reason she was there, it was during that time in which I said, food was just so hard to come by. And the story is, my parents went down there, and there was so many children there at this house that they were trying to catch rats that night to eat. So family members took those children. Our family members usually took those children. And one of I had 2 uncles who were deaf. They weren't. One of their uncles was still living at what was my mother's home place, and another uncle who was single living there, and they were still running a little farm. They took one. Was it Hunt? They called him Hunt. That was not his name. His last name was Christian. I can't remember in a little while I'll remember his name, but they took him. and he stayed with him, for a while, but for years. But anyway, he was working. I guess he was about 12 years old, or 10 or 12, and he went to work somewhere on somebody's farm. I don't know what it was. I guess they didn't pay him, and they gave him a gun for his pay. Well, he was so excited about this gun, he saw my uncle, my deaf uncle, was coming up the road or something. He was running back. My mother's home place wasn't very far from us, and Uncle Bob was walking up the road, and he showed it. He gave it to Uncle Bob to look at it. Uncle Bob picked it up and Hunt was trying to wave at him to not shoot, and he pulled the trigger, and it hit Hunt's leg. There was another time I remember my mother was washing. We were outside washing clothes. She ran down, and I guess to put the tourniquet there. They did get him to Washington, but he lost his leg. And in that family, he was living it. I told him all of those children. Sometimes some of them went to school with us, that little one-room school, and there were 3 younger children. Sometimes they had nothing but a jar of pickle to fight over to eat and all. But I do know God bless my mother and father. They did all they could all the time. My mother, even with the white people, my mother was probably the most educated person in the area. For their letters, for everything, they would come to her. They didn't even have the education. She would write letters for them.